Your name and spell it for him.
Okay.
Please say and spell your name.
Bobby F. McKown, Bobby F. McKown.
You ready to roll, Rob? 10-4. Bobby, it's going to be a late time talking to you, and as you and I know that we've seen a lot in the citrus industry, and Florida Citrus Hall of Fame is on a mission to tell the unwritten stories and history of the industry, and this year we're focusing on Florida Citrus Mutual, and there's no way that we can talk about Florida Citrus Mutual without talking to you. So this is a pleasure for us. You're a member of the Hall of Fame and have a rich history. So we're going to talk about Mutual and your recollections and everything else. Tell me a little bit on your career path before you got to Mutual. You worked at other citrus organizations?
Yes, I worked, my first job the first job I ever had in the citrus industry, I worked in Glen St. Mary's nurseries. Following the butter, I'd put the rosin wrap on the
Oh, you were
bud.
a wrapper, huh?
I was. 2 weeks later, you go back and unwrap. Got 50 cents a row from here to Cairo, Georgia, and 35 cents from here to Sop Choppy.
Yeah.
So, and that was my first. And then I worked in packing house as a younger boy, young person. Worked in processing plants while I was in college, and after, so that was my first. But my real first job professionally in the industry was working at the Florida Canners Association, as assistant to the executive vice president, Warren E. Savant. A tremendous person, high integrity, fine Christian man, and really just taught me so much about operations and how to deal with issues that are controversial within a group, an organization such as the Canners. So that was a great experience. I was there 9 years, and then had a great time. And the Canners at that time, my first day working there was a controversial issue. We were, as you remember, the 1962 freeze did significant damage to the industry, and they harvested all that fruit that was frozen, immature, and that was a terrible quality product produced.
And a lot of fruit on the ground they picked up and put it in the bucket.
If it was there, they took it.
Yeah.
And they processed it, and it produced a sorry, terrible product. And we lost customers, as you recall. So we put the first week we were working on the quality improvement program for FCOJ. And that's when it was put together during that fall in the hearings. And following that, they did a number of things to improve. They increased the bricks from 41.8 to 44.8 because Bob Rutledge and Mutual was pushing because the crop was too large, and they put one more orange in the can going from 41.8 to 44.8. So that reduced the supply, thereby enhancing the price. And then they increased the minimum ratio for oranges going into FCOJ to a 9 ratio, I think, or 10 ratio at that time. And then, in addition to that, they outlawed you could not pulp wash in the juice, but they could pulp wash, and you had to barrel it off separately. Well, you know what happened over time? They're funneling that pulp wash back into the juice. Then they factored the juice at the state test house. The state test house, you measure the box of fruit from the grower coming in, 100%. You get all the juice. Then they factored it back to 88%. So you got a 12% volume. It's somewhere. And so anyway, that was to be a quality improvement program with a light squeeze. And then in addition to that, then they hired Leonard and Newell, the advertising agency, the Department of Citrus, and they hired Nita Bryant then to come in, and she became the spokesperson for the industry. And then Campbell Ewald was the agency first, and they replaced them with Leonard and Newell. And from there, the industry began to grow with the Florida Sunshine Tree with Anita Bryant, one of the greatest marketing eras of the industry. So as a result also at that time, the Canners, a big project. That's when we had an air problem with feed mills. The emissions coming out of the stack would get on the women's clothes and hanging on the line, and they were just giving problems. And so then they assigned me, 26 years old, to develop work with Fish Gay Associates, an engineering firm,
Yeah.
to come up with some form of solution. I said, I don't know the front end from the back end of a solution.
You didn't know how to scrub anything, did you?
So anyway, I ended up going to Washington State because the apple processors were using scrubbing the water. And then I went to Boston and with the Underwood Canning Company, and that's where I met Senator Kennedy for the first time. Ted Kennedy, he looked like he's 10 years old, like me. But anyway, and from that we put in recommended scrubbers for the processor. I installed that. We went from an air problem to a water problem. You took all that gook and stuff and you discharged it into canals and everything, and the Lake Yale, you name it. And that lasted not very long. So that's when we had to come up with some solution. And out of that came the waste heat evaporator, high temp, whereby we take all that debris and burn it in the boiler to provide the fuel to run the concentrate plant. And so out of that came innovation. And I thought, I went home and told Yvette after we finished that project, I said, well, I'm probably out of a job because I don't know what else we're going to have to do. Little did I know. So that was just the beginning. But that is a funny thing. The first thing you're involved in a heavy controversial issue right then with that, trying to deal with it.
Yeah, well, you didn't get a slow start. You got a running start in the industry then, man.
That's exactly right.
So how'd you get to Mutual?
Well, after I left the Canners, then I went to FARI, Florida's Agricultural Research Institute. They contacted me and wanted me to come to what I consider coming to work. Bill Fifield, Dr. Fifield, dean of the, IFE, was retired, and he headed up. He was running FARI, and he was retiring, so I succeeded him. Frank Holland, Senator Holland's brother, was the original manager of FARI, and under Frank's tutelage, the 40-acre grove, the first grove that was given to Lake Alfred Experiment Station, was bought by FARI and given to them for research. So that was a big deal back in those days, sure, and continued to be. And so I went to FARI and I was there 5 years, and we had 68 members when I went, and when I left we had 125. We represented 100% of the pesticide, fertilizer, and limestone manufacturers in Florida. So, and then Mutual approached me about considering, because Tom Osborne had left on Halloween Day. They terminated Tom, and they contacted me if I'd be interested, and I said, well, I'm not sure. So I began to, I studied their finances, and I saw how terrible they were, and I thought it was pretty scary, to be honest with you. And at that time, the BRICS issue was ongoing, the battle between 41.8 and 44.8. And so they kept talking to me in the executive committee. I guess I had a number of interviews with the president, Art Mathias, and the executive committee. We finally I made a decision that yes, I would, if I was offered the position, I would accept it. And they offered it and had to meet with the full board, and they voted me in. I had one vote against me, I was told. But then I think they did acclamation for.
Oh, that's the story I read about that guy.
Yeah. So anyway, but when I got there, my first day at Mutual, I'll never forget it. I'd been there before with the interview. I'd seen the office, and I walked in, and there was one table, kind of like that. I guess that was my desk, and a straight chair with a cane back bottom that was just sagging.
Didn't look like they were expecting you to stay long,
And I
huh?
said, what happened to the furniture? They said, well, it was given away to someone over the weekend. I said, well, that's unusual. I said, okay. So I sit down at my phone is behind me. Oh, it's on this little desk too. So anyway, the next thing I know, at night, we had a little meeting with the staff, and my wife was there, and we had coffee, donuts, all that stuff. And all the niceties were saying, I everybody leaves, and I go back to my office, and Ed Dean, the controller, comes down and he says, well, we have a little problem. I said, what is that? He said, well, we can't make payroll. And I said, well, what do you do about that normally? Well, you need to call the processors, the handler, and see if we can pick up checks to deposit and make the payroll. I said, is this gonna be an ongoing process? He said, well, I don't know, I hope not, but as you know, we're broke. I said, yeah, I understand that. And I said, we owe $250,000 to the Imperial Bank on Memorial Avenue at 14% interest. And I said, here I can't even make payroll, and I'm going to have to worry about a note. So I said, okay. So I got on the phone, called a few, Golden Jim, different ones, and they said, sure. So we sent people up to pick up the check and make payroll. I said, boy, this is quite an omen, you know. I was happy where I was, and now here I am in this deal.
Now you're at the deep end of the pool, Bobby. You got to really swim hard.
And so the bricks issue was going on, so we were having a board meeting, and the next week, Wednesday, and then the commissioner hearing following that. So never will forget that meeting. Man, it was hot, and I mean, it was John Kennedy, who you know from Golden Jim.
Good friend, yeah.
John's a great guy, but he can express himself pretty forcibly. And so they were in there going, and he and Joe L. Davis, Sr., man, I'm sitting there and watching this back and forth. I said, my gosh, man, they're about to come to fisticuffs. But all of a sudden, they had some heated words. I mean, there were lots of them, but those two in particular with each other. And Mr. Davis jumped up from his seat in the round boardroom, and there's an office, a door here in that round room, and this door, he went in that door, and it got stone silent. Every eye on the door, because they all knew that was a closet, and he was going to have to come out of there.
Can we cut for just a second? I'm sorry.
John was a football player in the Coast Guard and everything
He
else.
was strong. I mean, man,
Yeah.
he was strong. Anyway, that was quite a hoot, and Mr. Davis came out, and he sheepishly walked around and went out the door and went wherever he went, and came back finally. But that was a funny story that...
Well, wasn't it a rather dramatic exit, was it?
Oh, it was. I was still silent, every eye following his exit.
So how did you turn Mutual around? This is
Well, when I met with the board and the executive committee at length before discussing the whole situation and seeing what the status of the industry was at that moment, I said, the only way that I see, I'm a businessman, a business person, that's what I am. And I said, everything we do for Mutual, in my opinion, the board should do with your policy and directives should be how to enhance the return on investment for growers. I said, that's what we're all about. And I said, that's really what Mutual was formed for, and then they tried to, through a federated co-op, when they organized mutuals, you know, they had to have at least 80% of the volume of fruit in order to actually activate Mutual. And you had to have the handlers, the packing houses, and all become members, handler members. So you had to have the whole process in excess of 80% of the volume. And then they assessed, as you know, if you went below the minimum price and broke the price, then there was a severe penalty they would assess against the grower that went below the price. Well, that's price fixing. And they certainly found out soon that who the FTC was, and you can't do that, and they're still under a cease and desist order today that they cannot enter into that type of agreement.
So the original intent of Florida Citrus Mutual was basically to control the price so that growers that were suffering, I guess, before Mutual was formed, they weren't making any money. So Mutual was going to come in and by controlling a large volume of the fruit, they could basically put a floor on the price of fruit.
Right. And what happened in World War II, all the volume of juice it was canned juice in those days, you know, canning, it went to the military. When the war was over, their only customer went away. They didn't have a customer. And so out of that then, prices, I remember as a kid on our back lot, grapefruit, a truckload of grapefruit, 5 cents a box, hoping that Bordeaux, citrus would open that next day and buy it for 5 cents a box. And many times you couldn't sell it, so you'd have to dump it. So it was pretty dire times during that. And that's how Mutual came to be. And from that then, I recommended to the board, the executive committee, I said, everything we do, whether it be dealing with water issue, because water, and I said, water is gonna become one of the most important aspects of the program of work at Mutual, in my opinion, to make sure growers have adequate water to irrigate their groves and operate. And I said, along with that, it's gonna be environmental issues, it's gonna be trade, and all of these things. And I said, that's what we must do everything we can, in my opinion, our work and effort. And our staff must be geared up to that, with that expertise, to deal with those issues. And I said, if that's what you're willing to commit and to do, and I know we don't have the money today, but we're gonna have to get the money. I said, I can do either one or two things. I told Art Mathias and the executive, I said, either I can be a Salvation Army kettle ringer trying to raise money, or you can provide the money through dues, and we'll do the work. Either or, it'll have to be either or those things. I said, you just can't spend all your time trying to raise money to operate on, and then have time to work too. And they said, I agree, that the money will be forthcoming. I said, okay, that's great. And they'd always been afraid to raise the dues beyond a penny. And I said, well, we'll see, let's see what happens. So my first thing, the first 90 days, I spent evaluating all the staff, interviewing all of them, evaluating everything, what they were doing, what their job. Then I had to cut 12 people out after 90 days. Didn't have any choice, money-wise. Mm-hmm. And then I knew we needed to move in some other direction, but we did that. And by June, I'd paid off the bank, the $250,000, and we didn't have any money to operate on. But then about the same time, I was faced with a tremendous burden, or whatever you want to call it, opportunity. That's when Tropicana was bringing in the juice from Brazil. They declared a Class 8 bonded warehouse within their plant, and said they were manipulating the juice from 65 bricks down to 17.3. So the tariff goes from concentrate 35 cents a pound solid to single strength 13 cents. So that's 22 cents that the growers it's going to cost them per pound solid. And so because I'd worked in the processing side, and when this person called me and asked me about it, they didn't know, they just heard the rumor. And I said, I knew exactly what was happening. And I called Raymer McGuire, our attorney, general counsel. Didn't have a penny to pay him. I mean, he was our general counsel. And I explained it to him, and I said, Raymer, we only have 4 days to file against the in commerce with a duty and drawback in order to turn this around, because they gotten it approved at the local district level, not in Washington. And I said, if it's devastating, it could be. He said, oh, he got on a plane, Raymer, boom, he's gone. He's in Washington. He called and said, I've got a guy that's just retiring from the head of duty and drawbacks. It's been recommended to us, Bernie Lyons. Is it okay to hire him? I said, sure. I said, let me call Art, talk to him, I'll be back to you. Called Mathias, he said yes. We hired Bernie. We went hearing in Washington on Friday. This was Monday night. And had the hearing, and they said they'd take it under further consideration. Monday they ruled against Tropicana and said they didn't rule. What they'd said was, we're going to overturn the district level. It hadn't been done at the national level. so that was good enough for us. And I said, okay. So then we went to full hearings, preparing, and we went in and proved in the hearing that they were not manipulating the juice, but they were actually manufacturing the juice, because you can't manufacture in a Class A bonded warehouse in a foreign trade zone. You can manufacture, you can manipulate it. They said all they were doing was adding water to it, where they weren't. They had to grind it. It was frozen. They had to grind it, do all the process. They were doing all the processing you do, except didn't take it down to 11.8.
Yeah.
So we prevailed on that. Ken Barbie and Dave Hamrick came to my office, 8 o'clock in the morning, and they said, "We want you to back off of this." I said, "I can't back off from it." I said, "This is a grower, this is the growers, this is my direction." I said, "That's our policy." "Well, you're going to back off." I said, "No, I can't back off." And they said, "Well, you know," they called me a few things, and they were good friends of mine. They said, "Well, you're gonna have your job." I said, "Well, I'll be honest with you. I was looking for this job, and I came, and I guess if that happens, I'll do whatever I have to do, but I can't change the position, that's where we are." And Ken said, "Well, I'm going to get fired." He was the president of Tropicana Beatrice. And he said, "I'll be fired because we reported $22 million to the bottom line of federal, public traded company for the quarter." I said, "Yeah, I know. That 22 million cost the growers 332 million. And he says, "Are you not going to change?" I said, "No, I can't. I've told you before." And anyway, they left. And then we litigated that case. Then they contested the ruling. And then the amazing thing, Joe Marshman called me from Citrus World, and he said, "I will give give you $25,000 to help on the legal." Well, that was like manna from heaven to me. So I said, "Thank you," and we went and picked the check up, and we started. And so, but then the thing that happened, John, after that, then I didn't have to pay the attorneys any longer once we won the case, and they appealed the ruling to Commerce through the International Trade Court. The United States Justice Department became the attorney of record, and we then assisted them as our attorneys with them, technically, to help them in the case. So we went to trial. There were 13 different cases that Tropicana filed individually on, and we won every one of those. So anyway, that was kind of the very first day of baptism.
It's really providential that you started off in the processing side to understand what was going on there,
Right.
because I worked as a extension agent, and we never got really involved with processors or packers. It was so specialized.
I understand.
But you were lucky in that you had that specialized training and brought that with you, or
I was.
it could have been a whole different story now.
Well, if it just been the end of that week, the tariff, because every processor would have filed to be a Class A bonded warehouse. They'd forced to, whether they wanted to or not, in other words, to reach that. So then we went from, and of course you move along from that, and there's all the trade issues. There's so much of that, but there's just a lot of things that happen so rapidly that you're having to deal with.
Well,
Bobby, I have one question real quickly. Who was it that told you about the rumor? Because that person,
He's deceased.
So if you hadn't gotten that, who
Yeah,
was that?
and
I'm
he
curious.
didn't understand it. That's what he was asking me. He said, "You know anything about this? Can you explain it to me?"
But who was it? Yeah. You can tell us now. That's an important thing.
It was Vince, and I've been trying to write my law. He was with Austin Caruso at his firm. He was a sales manager. And I'll be honest with you, I've gone blank. I know I've played golf with him all the time after that.
But isn't it fortuitous that he stumbled into his purview, and he said, "What the heck are you talking about?" And let me find out from somebody,
Yeah.
or otherwise it could have just.
In fact, it was at the Canners golf day at the Lake Region Yacht and Country Club. We'd finished playing golf, and he came up to me right after we finished, and he said, "What do you know about this?" He said, "Is this a rumor?" Boy, I said, I left there, went and got the payphone, called Raymer right then, before I went home.
Man, shows you, like the old saying goes, you can probably conduct more business on the golf course than you can in the boardroom.
Yeah.
But that was a very fantastic round of golf that you got involved.
Yeah, it was. So I just, and you know, I never told anybody who told me.
Yeah.
Because I just didn't want to bring any repercussion for him if there were, and I never said a word. This is the first time I revealed who it was.
Well, fantastic. So Bobby, these issues involving tariffs and trades were so, to me, they were above the average grower's knowledge or comprehension, but that was probably one of the major contributions that Mutual made to the industry in dealing with tariffs and issues involved. It almost seems that the industry got into a grower versus processor mentality so often, and trying to get some relief for the growers and some reality to the processor side of it must have been an ongoing battle for you.
It was like walking a tightrope, to be honest with you, because you have the processors. The Achilles heel for Florida Citrus Mutual is the handlers collect your money. When you introduce the fruit is introduced into the first primary channel of trade, then our dues were assessed at that time, as are the DOC and everybody, the taxes. And so you're dependent upon, and in the BRICS issue, the processor were resigning from Mutual and canceling their handler agreement and did not collect our money. We had some 15 that had, in the first 2 weeks I was there, that resigned. So there your resources, the means of collecting the resources is going away. And so I had to figure out some way of how to get that settled. And you know, so he came up with the idea on the BRICS issue to settle that thing, to go back to finish that. I kept talking to Art and different ones, and I talked to old Jim Griffiths, who worked for Mutual, and I said, Jim, I said, what is the average natural BRICS of all oranges in Florida? And I said, hey, it's domestic. What would it be? So they worked and came up with it and said it's 12.8. So I said, well, we're not going to settle this. This thing's we've got to find an out for everybody. So I went to Art and I said, Art, this is what I would recommend that we pursue. I said, go to the Department of Citrus. If the board approves, we recommend that we stay with 44.8 for 18 months. If we can't, and if we can't, we have to amend the federal standard of identity to reflect 44.8. If we're not successful, then we will, the thing is, we should adopt the average natural BRICS as 42.8. And I said, recommended we go to 42.8. We've petitioned Food and Drug to amend the federal standard of identity to reflect the average natural BRICS for 18 months. After 18 months, if we're not successful, then we will adopt and revert to the national standard, whatever that is. And he says, well, man, that's complicated. I said, well, but I said, it's an avenue to get where we need to get and solve it. I said, we have to come with a solution. And so he said, okay. I said, now I have an idea. Why don't we take this to some Hardee County grower, explain it to them and let it become their idea and present it. So it'd end up with Joe Davis being his idea. and that's what happened. And I knew we would never get 44-8 approved because California and Texas was opposed. We'd already met with them, they would be opposed because they couldn't meet. They don't have that, their fruit's not aligned to be juice fruit like ours, except Texas. But I knew we had, that was an out, and that's what we did. That's how we solved the 44-8 bricks issue. And so anyway,
So on this level, you're dealing with rather complicated issues, and what were some of the interesting board members that you have? We're going to want to shift gears a little bit,
sure.
you know, and obviously Art Mathias, he was an icon in the
Right,
industry,
yeah.
production manager at Haines City and so forth. Some in the early years, besides the altercation between Davis and Kennedy, some of the other stories you can remember about board members and things
yeah,
that
well,
happened.
we had one that was a CPA, and he came in and thought he was going to be the, you know, he was a CPA, so he wanted to tell us how to run daily operations, and I said, listen, the board sets policy, it's my responsibility to implement the policy. And then he had us wanted us to amend the federal tax laws all the time for different benefit for growers, the changes he wanted. And finally, the board just said, listen, we're not gonna do your work for you in your private practice. You're a citrus grower on this board, and that's what you're gonna have to do. And Bill Rady was the president, and he told him, and he just said, this is it. We're not gonna keep listening to all this.
We've been down that rabbit trail for long
Yeah.
enough.
And we're just not gonna do that. But, you know, we had an excellent board, by and large. Every board that I had when I was working at Mutual, I thought they were very, you had some like Bill McMullen and George and Mr. Parton, Charlie Parton, they'd been on there forever. But they had history that was important for you to keep that, and they were true growers, they really were. And so we had good people. The river folks always, I always could sense a little bit of strife between the river board members and the interior. And never did surface, so to speak.
The river people were very protective of that Indian River
They were.
name and marketing ability that they have, and they still are, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
And so I imagine it didn't sit well with them if you bought a box of grapefruit from Haines City and Fort Pierce and sold it as Indian River grapefruits. And,
Yeah. So anyway, you know, but by and large, we had excellent presidents, in my opinion. And I never got involved in, I made a policy to never get involved in who was going to be a director, running for directors, and I wouldn't let any of the staff get involved in that. And I used to tell the staff, I said, listen, I'm your best friend you have. I said, I'm going to tell you something about boards. I said, you come in here once a month and they see you, or you see them. And I said, you may think you're their best buddy, but I'm telling you, when it comes right down to it, that'll be the one to make the motion to fire you. You remember that you work for me, and that's what I'm looking for you to remember.
You're covering their back.
That's right. And I said, that's just the way it operates. And Warren Savant taught me a lesson, a good lesson, and I remember it. Minutes are never important till you need them. And when you have to have them, when you need them, they have to pass a test. And you must be very meticulous and accurate in recording the minutes of your meetings. And so I made sure that happened to the best of my ability. And he also taught me another thing. He says, you're friends with your directors, but don't socialize with them. Because he said in the farming community, by and large, you may say something just off the cuff in general conversation that that person doesn't agree with, doesn't like, and they will never forget it.
Can't take back those words, can you?
So
Even more so when they're written down.
I tried to follow that the best I could.
Well, you were blessed with some really good folks, and your board members all were growers. I mean,
Yes.
they had a very strong affinity to grower issues. Well,
Right.
let's talk a little bit about some of the other issues like environmental deal. Your early observations about water sure came to a fruition. We're still battling about water issues, and
Yeah.
so what were some of the environmental ones that you can remember that?
Well, the environment, the water issue, as you know, we had consumptive use permits came in, then you had to go and buy meters, and you got Swift Mud in South Florida to give some monies toward purchase of meters. And then you had to calibrate them all, keep that up.
Yeah.
And everything, all that's another expense that growers didn't want to do, and they fought. And the thing about water was that I knew early on, I said the consumptive use permit, and Wayne Mixon taught me this early, when in the 1960s. He said, man, pine trees don't vote, people vote. And when the people get the preponderance of need for people, they're going to get the water. And he said, anything that you can do to lock in your right, eastern water rights are totally different than western water rights. You don't own the water in the east, and in the west you own the right to the water on your land. Here it's like quail. The quail, it's your quail, it's on your land. When the quail leave, there's somebody else's. And that's the same thing with water. And so, that's when I went to Swift Mud and kept working with the executive director saying, listen, we were doing overhead, and they were just on us about overhead. I said, if we can remove and move ahead and move and get the industry to convert to low volume irrigation over time, and I already know, IFAS already told me, you don't save much water, you just save some of the evaporation, but it's a perception of overhead versus microjet. And I said, if you'll let us go, encourage us and work with us to go to micro, and we'll work with the growers to go to microjet versus overhead, then would you allow us to have unlimited source of freeze protection water above the cups when freezes occur? I said, because that's a salvation. We have to have that. So work that out. It's still in effect today, and that's been not going against me. And then we were able to cut the cups use the consumption rate because we all asked for far more water than what we need, and we'd already done study. We knew through IFAS that we could cut the consumptive use permitting down, and that made them feel good too.
Well, see, this is classic, as far as I can see, is that you were able to take research information, whether it's irrigation, water use, or whether it was nitrogen, and take that and enroll it into livable regulations that growers could survive with.
Right.
And same thing when we found nitrates in groundwater, and all of a sudden everybody wants to cut the fertilizer out, but you got to have someone like Mutual who knows what's going on in the research, but they can translate that into livable regulations that growers could survive
Right.
and deal with. So just another one of those tightropes you walk down. You must have extremely good balance.
Well, I don't know if I think I'm paying the price today for balance.
Well, I don't know. It seems like to me everything you got into, it wasn't clear cut this way or that way. You had to kind of weave your way through some minefields.
And then just thinking of when we filed the countervailing duty case against Brazil, that was the first case we filed, and the processors didn't like that at all. But they were the Brazilians were subsidizing the growers and the planting of the groves. And so we won that case, and we should have had a 17% margin of duty on top for the countervailing duty case. But President Reagan's White House, they told me, said, we're going to give you, you're going to win the root, because the Federal Trade Commission had ruled in our favor. And he said, you're going to get the ruling. Deaver told me, worked for, and he says, but it's not gonna be at 17 because of Brazil fighting that in our State Department. And I said, well, I said, it should be 17+%. He said, it should be, but politically, it can't be. So we're gonna give you a win, but it's not gonna be that. I said, well, what's that gonna be? What is it? And so the Secretary of Commerce, who was from Wyoming and Montana, he was a bronc buster guy. And they came down to 1.9%. But the thing is, that put us in a position on trade that we were further declared as citrus as import sensitive. So that means that our tariff would be treated separately under trade negotiations. And that was one of the things that we got out of the countervailing duty. And I knew after countervailing duty, the subsidies, they would move next to dumping the product in the U.S. And that's when we filed the dumping case against them on that, and it's still in effect to a degree today.
Okay, now, in all of these dealings,
Wait, what were those? Okay, go ahead.
all right, so, talk a little bit about some of these elected officials and appointed officials that you can remember that, were either A, extremely helpful, or B, totally antagonistic, and who were some of the go-to people that you had that when you needed some things done?
Well, the automobile is out. This is IRS.
How have you survived all these years without these people?
I know it, I don't know, my best friend.
Okay, we're good now.
So legislators.
Okay, well, we depended a lot on of course, your Polk County legislators were, because we were headquartered in Lakeland, but also Lake County and the Indian River District. But the old Fred Jones, he was just a good old boy, but he was one of the guys that really helped us and carried us, and then Curtis Peterson being he was the president of the Florida Senate, and he helped us a lot. And the guy we dealt with that was a pain in the whatever was George Kirkpatrick. And Earl Wells called me one day and he said, Bobby, said, Senator Kirkpatrick, he's from Gainesville. He said, want you up here in the morning. I said, Earl, I said, it's 3 o'clock, son. I said, he said, you have to be here in the morning. I said, at his office, Senate office. I said, okay, I'll be there. So I drove up there that night and going to see him next morning. He jumped on me and he said, I'm gonna tell you something. I'm gonna hit you with a hammer if you don't go down there and get Ben Hill Griffin to shut up and quit saying the things he's saying about me. I said,
So you could control Ben Hill,
yeah,
huh?
yeah. I said, Senator, I'm not gonna say anything, Mr. Griffin. What do you mean you're not gonna say anything? I'm telling you, if you don't, you're gonna rue the day. I said, well, I'm sorry. I said, I work for Mr. Griffin and all the growers. But if you think I'm gonna go down there and tell him not to speak to the press about you, that he disagrees with you, I'm not gonna do that. I can't do it, and I'm not. He said, well, you are an SOB. I said, well, I guess I am, but I'm not gonna do that. I said, I'm not doing it. That's just the end of that. What else do you have to want to talk about? He said, well, that's it. I said, well, he
Good
said,
day, huh?
he said, well, what do you think I should do? I said, I'm not here to advise you. I'm just saying you don't need to take on Mr. Griffin because that's just a waste of time. That's the way he feels about it, and he can raise a lot of money in opposition to it, so the best thing to do is not say any more about it. He said, well, did you get me into the phosphate pits to fish? I said, Lord of mercy. So, he was and the strange thing about the Congress, remember when we had the fruit frost program, and every year you had to fight till we got fawn up and really going so it would work. We had to have the fruit frost program continue, and DeMuth, there was a guy named DeMuth in OMB that would line item to zero every single year in the budget. And so I'd have to go and work with to try to keep it in. And so old Congressman Shaw, Jim Sawyer from New York, the Bronx of New York, he's the chairman of the committee. Well, he didn't know fruit frost from a goose. And so I said, so I got to know him, I had to know it. Don Fuquay said, you're gonna deal with Jim Sawyer. He said, you're gonna have to deal with, because he was the chairman of the overall committee on space and aeronautic and all that came up. He said, you're going to have to deal with Jim though. He said, now he's from the Bronx, and said he's a crusty old dude. So I went and I met with him and kept talking to him, and finally he said, he said, I'm a diabetic. And he said, you have any grapefruit? I said, yes, sir. I said, we broke out, as they say in the South, we broke out with grapefruit. And he said, well, I'll tell you what. I said, can you have any you could give me? I said, yes, sir. I said, how much do you want? He said, well, I'd like a case every 15 days. He said, I eat grape a lot because I'm diabetic. I said, where you want to ship to, here or your home in the Bronx? He said, no, here. So I shipped him a case of grapefruit the 1st and 15th of every single month. And we got 2 cases of grapefruit a month. We kept the fruit frost program going until we didn't need it anymore.
Yeah, we finally lost it in '96. I imagine by then he'd grapefruited out and gone.
Yeah, I think so. But we were fortunate in Florida to have the power we did in the Congress. You had Danny Fasell, Foreign Relations Chairman. You had Don Fuquay, Chairman of Aeronautics and Space. You had Sam Gibbons, the Chairman of the Trade Committee, and he's Vice Chairman of the Ways and Means. You had Senator Childs, who was on the Finance Committee. And then we were just very fortunate with the timing, and we had Dick Stone before that. Then you had, golly bum, the congressman from Ocala. I'll think of their names. Names I could remember forever. Now I'm getting pretty poor about it.
You're better than me. I can't remember my name half the time.
He's Vice Chairman of Appropriations, and then you had Bob Seitz, who was Chairman of the committee, and then you had Claude Pepper, who was Chairman of the Rules Committee, and you go right on down the line, and then Paula Hawkins was elected to the Senate when Reagan went in, and that was very fortunate because the Republicans took over the Senate, and Bob Dole was the chairman, the majority leader. And so we had the entree with people in Florida that had powerful positions that could really help us, and they did. And so we went to see Sam Gibbons about the tariff issue. We had to pass the Class 8 bonded warehouse. That was a temporary fix because we had to pass legislation to ensure that always concentrate for tariff purposes. So we go, Raymer and I, they were roommates in college, so we go to Sam's office, and I knew Sam very well. We go to Sam's office and say, Mr. Chairman, we have a little issue, because he was a free trader, buddy, from all the way. And we explained, and Raymer said, Bobby's going to explain to you our issue. So I explained it to him what our issue was, and I said, we just need we need an amendment, and here's the language we're thinking about to solidify, just bring the current tariff in line with maintaining as it is today. He said, I don't know, I'm opposed to that. I said, I've been working 30 years against that kind of stuff. What you're proposing? Man, my heart just fell out. I just sunk. And I said, well, Mr. Chairman, I'll tell you what, would you give us some time and just keep the door open and let us go back and work and see if there won't be any change in the tariff situation. We just want to see a way to clarify, to maintain status quo. I'm before that. I said, okay. I said, God. I said, we got to go find this. So went and got with our attorney in New York, the trade, with Raymer. I said, his name was Tom Honey, and Jim Lundquist was the other, and I said, Tom, we got to be creative now to find a way to maintain the structure of the tariff law, 1930 amended, without indicating that there's any increase in duty. I said, and so they worked on that thing, and we finally came to the deal, the language of once concentrate, always concentrate for tariff purposes. And that passed, had to pass that bill 9 times before it became law. No, Reagan vetoed it 3 times because it was a part of an omnibus trade bill, and he was opposed to it. Not against us, just.
You had bad friends.
But what happened and what worried me and scared me more and more, the more people if your opponents become educated of what you're trying to do, then they begin to be drawn to, you get more honey, flies to the honey bucket than you want. And so every time it occurred, and that's what, and when I had to pass 9 times. And so Kika De La Garza was chairman of the House Ag Committee. I told him, I said, Mr. Chairman, I said, I need to put grapefruit in this same bill and pass it. He said, oh no, we're not doing the whole conglomerate. I said, okay, so I'd stop that. So he said, I'm not opposed to it, but we're not gonna do a fruit basket. I said, yes, sir. I said, that's right, Mr. Chairman, we're not gonna do a fruit basket. And so so anyway, we finally got it passed, signed into law. Then I had to go back and pass the grapefruit, the same thing for grapefruit juice, because you had Belize and other places trying to transship juice in here from other places. And so, anyway, we finally passed it and got it solidified into the law. But I tell you, it was easy at first to be passing it, but the more processors out of state, dairies and processors saw what was happening and they could take advantage of the reduced tariff, boy, they were always drawing opposition, but we finally passed and prevailed, and that was a big day. It really was. The worst day, you asked me about the worst day. The worst day in my life should have been the best day in my life, was when NAFTA passed. NAFTA, I never will forget it. I was at the White House back and forth, Mickey Cantor, the special trade rep at the time, and Clinton was president. And you never want to be the last thing that's dealt with in a trade agreement, because there's too much inertia. Citrus was the last. And the Brazilians had sent their people up, and Phil Herndon and I met with them on a Saturday. Phil came out to hunting camp, met me in Disney World at the hotel. We met with the Mexican processors, and they wanted to agree to more tariff rate quotas coming in duty free. I said, I didn't give 1 inch. And they left irritated, mad, and called us all kind of Mexican names. And Phil went back to the hunting camp, took his suit off, went back to hunt. I went home. And so then that week, with Mickey Cantor, he said, you need to be here and watch. And I told him, I said, and Mickey said, Bobby, you got to go more on the tariff. I said, can't go any more tariff rate. I can't allow any more duty-free juice on single strength or concentrate than what they have shipped in here in previous years, which was a small amount. And he said, okay, that's the bottom line. And I said, another thing, if we're going to do this NAFTA deal's going, and I know it. I said, the votes are there. But I said, the Uruguay trade round has not been completed. I said, I want an agreement from you and the president. Brazil is our Achilles heel, and you know it. And I said that you will not reduce the duty on orange juice under the Uruguay trade round any amount or no more than the least minimum that can be reduced. This would be required under the WTO. Yeah. And so he said, all right. I said, I want it in writing. I said, I don't want it by verbal. You may be gone and everybody may be gone. And so they did. They wrote it. They gave it to me. And anyway, so then Bill Clinton, and so at 4 o'clock in the morning, he said, Mickey said, all right, said the president, you know, he has to talk to Fox, who's the president of Brazil at the time, Mexico. He says, got to call him now. And this is as far as we go, and this is the deal, and we won't go anymore. And he said, the deal won't go through if we can't get this done. I said, yeah, right, I know, bull, and I don't believe that to myself. I was saying, that's right, I'm saying to him. So Clinton called him, talked to him, went over the whole deal with him on the phone and says, this is it, this is the bottom line, this is as far as we're going, this is a go or no go. He said, I'll have to get back to you in an hour. He said, okay. He called back an hour later. Fox says, we don't like it, but we'll do it. And that's how it ended. And then I called at 6 o'clock. I called Bernie Lester and different ones early in the morning just to let them know that it had gone and done. And it's subject to the approval of the Congress, but it was finished in what it was. And I'm in the sugar guys and the vegetable folks. It's easy for the sugar guys to say, oh, we're totally against NAFTA, we're against, because they've already worked out their deal with they have sugar growers all over the country. They already worked out the deal, so they can be clean and pure and be self-righteous, standing up, you know, carrying the flag. And I said, well, you got your deal, and then we had to have it too, ours for us. I said, just the way it is, guys. And the river, and if I'd have had 8 weeks or 6 weeks to gone out in the industry and educated them on the deal, what happened, and how it is, then but it's like a big ship. If you can't turn it, you don't have enough time, you're gonna run ashore. Mm-hmm. And I mean, instead of being a great day, it was an awful day. And I went to the Indian River Citrus League Board in Gala. I mean, and Jim Backus went with his congressman, and he was explaining to them what it was going to do. And I mean, they almost were ready to hang me.
They weren't interested in they weren't interested in listening to reason.
No,
they all wanted to have their
just
say.
It shouldn't happen. Well, I mean, it's a big world out there, boys. You don't understand. And so that's just. But that was a bad day. That was an awful time, and I didn't know how it was all going to come out before it was over. But honestly, as far as I was concerned, but we were people that knew, and then we had to go to the vote for the Congress, and then that's when Mickey said, "Now you got to get 15 Florida members voting for this in the House." So I can't get. I can't get 15. I knew I could, but he said, I said, I'll get 12. I can guarantee you 12. I'll deliver 12. 15, no. I said, 12, that's all I can do. And he said, okay, 12. I said, now here's the other thing. I said, if every member, I don't want you to let other Democrats walk on voting, because I want the bill to pass by enough votes. If every member of the Florida delegation voted no, it would still pass. He said, that's a tall order. I said, well, I have to have that. I said, that's just it. He said, okay. And that's it. So he had Bill, the Congressman, Bill Daley, from Chicago. He was a Commerce Secretary. And so I'd been working with him very close on this stuff. And he said, Bobby said, how'd you talk him into that? I said, well, I said, I can't live with it any other way in Florida. It just won't fly. And he said, well, I understand that, but I said, that's a tall order. We got to get 200, that means we have to get 238 votes to satisfy your need. I said, no, so?
Work at it.
I said, we'll work at it. So we did, anyway, it did pass by exactly, if every member of Florida voted against it, it would still pass. But it was a tough deal, just like you were Benedict Arnold, but when you know a bill that's going to pass, you know something's inevitable going to happen. you best make the best deal you can.
Sure.
That's all there is to it.
Yeah.
And that's what we did.
Don't go burning any bridges, because you might need to go down
And
that one
they kept
again
asking,
too.
well, what's your fallback position? I said, I don't have a fallback position. Mickey said, why? I said, because you adopt a fallback position, that is now your position. I said, so we don't have a fallback position, this is it.
Okay,
And
can
I
we,
believe that.
can we hold on?
It truly was.
Well,
And,
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, the dynamics of the industry certainly have changed. We don't have the large number of small growers. We don't have the true grower co-ops and
Right.
everything else that are there. And you know, when you and I were there, freezes were our big enemy. You know, and
Yeah.
could really impact us. And we never had to deal with a greening issue.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
all the diseases. You know, we found solutions for burring nematode
Yeah,
and
right.
diaprepes and all these. But so let's talk about characters. You mentioned Ben Hill Griffin Jr.
Yeah.
Was he a friend or foe?
Oh, he was a great friend. He was a mentor for me. And in fact, he was not a member of Mutual till I went to Mutual. And he wasn't, his fertilizer business was not in FARI till I was at FARI, and I worked, and when I was at the Canners, I worked with him a lot. And just to give you a friend, I worked at the Canners. And he became president. He told Warren, he said, I want to work with Bobby during the year I'm president on different things. Warren said, fine. So he was getting a divorce at that time. He's living in Winter Haven in an apartment, and not too far from my mother-in-law. But anyway, he called me one day and said, Bobby, I want to have breakfast with you. I said, yes, sir. I said, what time you want me to meet you? He said, how about 6 o'clock? No, he said, how about 5:30? I said, yes, sir. I said, 5:30, yes, sir. Where? Come pick me up in my apartment. Told me where it was. I'd already scouted it out. I knew where it was. So I got there, man, I was there at 5:15. He saw the lights, and he looked out the drapes, and he looked. 5:30, he came out and got in. We went down to Haven Cafe when they opened and had breakfast. And next, he said, well, let's have breakfast next week. I said, okay. I said, what time? He said, be here at 5 o'clock. I said, 5 o'clock? Okay, yes, sir. Man, I was at 4:45 again. I went and told Mr. Sidewell, I said, Warren. I said, damn, I'm going to be there at midnight pretty soon. We're going. And so after that 5 o'clock deal, then the next, he said, we'll have breakfast next week. I said, yes, sir. What time will be here? Be here by 7:30. He just tested me to see if I was going to be there on time. I think. I don't know for sure. But anyway, so that was, but I never will forget a funny thing happened. We were working, remember the old STAB Act, stabilization?
Mm-hmm.
And they were trying to figure out how to make that pooling deal work. And I'd already concluded that Warren and I had that pooling. I said, we already have a pool, it's in Brazil. I said, man, if you have a pool here of juice that they're going to feed into the market when the price is high, you're always going to be destined for low prices. I said, the only way you make any money is citrus and commodity is up and down. I mean, the price goes up, the supply something happens, and it goes up. And but I said, you know, and we started meeting at 8 o'clock at the Canners, about 15 board members. They were studying this thing, Emmett Evans, people, and likes, and you name it. And we've been in there all day. I mean, John, all day long meeting. And they'd smoking these cigars that long. These guys, I think they bought the largest, longest, blackest cigar they could find on meeting days. And you couldn't see your hand in front of you almost. And so this is kind of off color what I'm going to say that Ben Hill said. So about 4 o'clock, he leaned back in his chair in Warren's office and kicked his shoes off, and he took a little nap, so to speak. And by that time, about 5 o'clock, he kind of came to it. He says, all right, I know there's some effing going on. I want to get in on it. And he said, this meeting needs to adjourn. He said, because there's nobody in the world smart enough to figure out this pooling process. And he said, he said, if somebody's gonna get it, and I wanna be in on getting it. And so that meeting adjourned on that note. And everybody left, and Mr. Savant said to me, he said, well, what did you think about the meeting? I said, well, they discussed every aspect that in my opinion, that you could dream up about pooling. And I said, none of it can ever work mechanically, I don't see. And I said, Jack Berry had the best comment of all, Senior. He said, folks, if you want to be in poverty forever, then you develop this pooling mechanism. He said, that it's just not ever gonna work. And administering it is just a nightmare. I told Warren, I said, I'd like to have the job administering if they put it in. Because I'll tell you, it'd be a lifetime deal.
Job, yeah.
And what are you gonna do?
Yeah.
But,
Kind of like being a bankrupt attorney, just draw this thing out till there's nothing left, huh?
and anyway, that was quite an interesting time. And of course, you had a lot of growers that had different, you know, a lot of growers always have an idea how you're gonna handle the price, and you can do something about the price. Well, I told one time we'd been talking quite a while, and he'd chewing me out pretty good, and I said, well, let me tell you something. I said, just think about this. I said, if I could set the price and control the price, I wouldn't be working here. I'd be cornered the market and be gone. I said, there's no way.
Yeah, it's always a challenge, isn't it? They expect you to work miracles, and you can't control the weather, you can't control the price, you can't control a lot of things.
But you know that last freeze, the '89 freeze, Bill Rayleigh called me, and he says, Bobby, he said, man, what do you think? I said, Bill, it's 28 degrees at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we're just headed to night. I said, this is going to be a terrible freeze, '89. I said, what 83 and 85 didn't finish, this is going to finish, it looks like to me. And you know, you remember we had 56 or 8 hours of sub-freezing temperatures. And man, it killed my brother and I's grove. We had 100 acres. It killed those groves straight through to the roots in Polk County.
You know, see, in Lake County, we'd already been through that in '83 and
I know.
'85. We didn't have much left
No,
to
you
kill in
didn't.
'89. It was all gone.
And you know, you're talking about unusual people. Old Monk Hughes, Jim Hughes' daddy, old Monk, he drove a Lincoln automobile all the time. And remember they had that model came out, the 2 doors open like this. And he had that, he's up in the freeze. I think it was the 80, no, it was about the 72, 77 freeze, somewhere along there.
Yeah.
Overhead was going, no, 62 freeze.
62 was overhead.
And
Yeah.
the overhead going, and he was up in Haines City area for his groves, and it was that overhead going, and man, it started time to get out. He couldn't get out of his car. The ice had frozen the doors shut. He couldn't get out of his automobile. and you know what a mess that was. So didn't have cell phones in those days, so he finally had to just wait till it warmed up some to get out because the doors were frozen solid, you know. And groves, good friends of mine, I mean, it split those groves. That ice was so heavy, it just split those grapefruit trees right in center, in two.
Yeah.
And you go out there and you look, and the whole grove is just devastated like a storm been through. So that really began to change people's idea about overhead for freeze protection, was not the thing to do, so.
No, we had to move away from that. That's another great example of where the theory says that if you put on an X amount of water and it freezes and it gives off this amount of heat, you're in business. But they didn't take into consideration some of the practical things. First of all, the sprinklers got to go faster than these were going, so the ice load was just tremendous. So kind of, people got gun shy from water. We had to work
Yeah.
hard to get them to accept
Right.
micro sprinklers.
And then, of course, one of the most, Red McGee was one of the most colorful souls you'll ever see. Big old eyebrows and this kind of stuff. And he was always cantankerous as they could be, you know. He had his one client he represented.
That's right.
That was it. And he did it very well.
Now, Mr. Davis and I had some interactions, I can tell you about that. Only reason Mr. Davis ever talked with me was that when CD was in Gainesville, he and my father were friends.
Yeah.
And they both left school and sold office furniture in Eustis for a while. And then my father went back to Largo, and Mr. Davis went to Howie in the Hills and told my father, that's when you really screwed up, you know. But Mr. Davis would have me come, I come in the office and he'd say, John, he said, I want to tell you something. He said, you're here because you're the son of a friend of mine, not because you work for the government.
Yeah, right. Well, he was.
So you and Red McGee were buddies, huh?
Oh no, God, he just.
Everything you did, he had the opposite
He'd
side,
write
didn't
it up, write you up, and he just, I got so I didn't even read his stuff, because I knew it was gonna be bad and make you feel, and so I said, just forget it, I'm not gonna do it. And so I said, and then, one of the things I didn't like, the board had determined they wanted Jim Griffith to retire, and they told me I had to retire. I said, well, so finally, because he just kept doing things, he would operate outside the rules of the board. I mean, he'd take it on his own and set his own rules.
Yeah.
As you know, Jim.
Oh, yeah.
And he'd go do something and he'd get you in hot water, and so finally I went to him and said, Jim, you reached the point, I guess it's always that time, and we're gonna have a going away party for you. And so we did. I framed the resolution with 40 grade sandpaper around it, you know, so, and so, anyway, but Jim was a very bright guy, you know, very bright.
Well,
and
you need people like Jim Griffiths and Frank Bouis
Oh, yeah.
To go, you
Didn't
know.
ever know what Frank was saying, understand him, but he'd go around his elbow to get to his finger, you know, but.
When you're an MIT graduate, I guess
Yeah,
that's how you
and,
deal with
Frank
things.
was he was a colorful guy and smart man, he really was, and but he had some strange ideas about how you could get there from here, and it wasn't received very well with his fellow commissioners when he was on the commission, you know, and everything, but I like Frank. I thought he.
Well, you gotta have some free thinkers out there to at
Sure.
least expose people some different ideas and see
Right.
what's gonna come up with, you
Yeah.
know. That was,
And, then of course Jerry Chacon with his cliches and saying all the time. I told Jerry one night, Jerry, you ought to be in New York being advertising, promotion. I said, you have all these ideas, you ought to be utilizing them somewhere.
yeah, with Jerry, yeah, Jerry was his own man, and he still has a lot of ideas. We'll talk about ideas. Frank Bouis, toward the end, talked to me a couple times. He said, John, he said, you know, I've got just a bunch of great ideas I know that could really have an impact. He said, but I haven't got the energy to get them done. He said, so if you come across any young guys or girls, they're looking for something to do, have them come see me. I can keep them busy for a long time. So
Well, I agree he could.
he had one thing after another. Well, I enjoyed the story about the into the closet. Any other things that you remember that were kind of added some levity to serious situations or things like that? You know, these kind of things that happen every once in a while.
Well, yeah, and they are, but no, not I do, but I
Yeah,
don't.
yeah,
You
okay.
know,
Well, Bobby, it was I know it was a tremendous ride for you, and as an extension person, you know, we worked with Mutual all the time in various things, and there were couple of stories that I remember about the field men that would come by, and of course, Rusty Weigel and I have been good friends for a number of
Yeah,
years, and
right.
you had some great people that worked out in the field and represented Mutual,
Right.
I think, and that was one way of getting Mutual into the groves and into the environment, and getting people on board. So we talked about the industry changing, and so I guess my last question is, after all your years of experience and seeing what's happened, how do you see Mutual going? I mean, look at the tremendous impact that it's had with the greening and the reduced crop, and Mutual's had to sell the building, and
Yeah.
Growers are in dire straits, and are they still going to support Mutual? Where do you see this organization going?
Okay, just for that, let me comment one thing. Early on, I knew, a Mutual, we had, quote, 15,000 growers, they said. Well, we ferreted all that down to what we did an audit to make sure how many, and we got rid of had to move a lot from the rural rows that were not. There really never were that many growers in Florida, as you know. There were entities of different partnerships and all that, so everyone was a member, but anyway, I said the only way you can communicate with that many people, that's like a constituency, is through the triangle and our grower reps out in the field. And I said, that's why I told her, I said, I want to make sure the triangle, I want to set it tight and have as much information as we possibly can put in the pages we have available, and communicate, not just fill it up, but fill it up with information that they can use. And that's what my desire and goal was. And then our field men have to have information to them to communicate to growers, and then feedback from growers to us of what they think the board should be doing, the organization should be doing, and all of that. And so, now moving on to Mutual today, the thing that I see that's different today, when we were in the industry working, always forever, the industry prided itself in the fact that we weren't price supported, we weren't subsidized, we didn't have any government subsidies, and we paid our own way, advertising, promoting, all that. We stood on our own. Today, it's changed with greening. It seems so much of the effort now is what type subsidy programs can we get, research more and more, seeking federal, state dollars to come into it. And we can no longer say we're not price supported or subsidized. Research is needed all the time in order to have an ongoing industry or anything you're doing. If you don't have adequate research and adequate resource dollars, you're not going to survive a long time. I don't care if you're in the pharmaceutical business
Absolutely.
or anything.
It took us a while to get to that point,
Yes.
though, Bobby. There for a number of years, we thought we could regulate ourselves out of
Yeah.
an issue. We could just subsidize growers to push out trees, and we were gonna get rid of canker.
Yeah.
And did we get rid of canker? No, we started in 1913 to get rid of canker, and we still have it.
I don't think we ever got rid of it.
Yeah, the sad thing is, though, that we can't research our way out of greening, at least right now.
I agree.
We're gonna have to do that, but
Well,
that's the only hope we do have,
the canker deal was a travesty, in my opinion. And I never will forget the night they had the hearing in Lakeland's, the DOC. And everybody, we're going to have to burn coast to coast, only way. And I listened to that all day and all night, and it was finally close to the end. I mean, it was almost 12 o'clock at night, and we're still going. And I asked Chairman B. to recognize him. Mr. Chairman, I said, it reminded me of a bunch of drunks sitting around in a bar, and they're drunk, and in the morning they're gonna wake up and say, what in the hell did I do last night? I said, we're not gonna burn this industry from coast to coast, and we're gonna operate this industry, and we're gonna have to find out how to do it. And so, I don't think what we've been saying here all day, that's not going to happen. I think I would recommend that we close this meeting and we get on to thinking about in the next few days of how we are going to operate this industry. And so that, I shut it down, that closed the meeting. But it was just hysterical. And I said, you know what we've been listening to, and myself included all, we've listened about canker as like a folklore that's been passed down, that it's such a boogeyman that it was just the end of time. And then we thought we had canker, and we didn't, turned out. And that was such, and one of the hardest decisions, I was on that Doyle Connor made me be on that committee that had to vote everything, and he wasn't doing anything the vote didn't say. Well, we couldn't do anything the scientists would tell us that we were locked into that. You had to be. You couldn't just. And Duda got so irritated because they had 5,000 acres they had to destroy. And they had an idea that let's use that as a test to measure and see. Well, I couldn't vote for that when I'm gonna burn a 40-acre grow or a 10-acre grow.
Yeah.
And boy, they got so upset with me, and they withdrew, and finally we worked it out. But golly bum, I said, I'm with you, I agree, but I said, if the scientists won't tell us that, but how can I burn the other guy and not you? I said, you have to be consistent regardless. It may be consistently wrong, we probably are,
Yeah.
but you have to be consistent. Can't treat you because you're big versus the other fellow, we burned him out.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm sorry, but that's just the way I see it, and I'm sorry about that. I really am. That was really a bad day for the whole thing for the industry.
It was, and now the cloud over the industry is greening, and I'm sure that Mutual's trying to survive just like the growers surviving.
Coming back to that, it appears to me, there's going to be an industry, John, in my opinion. It's not going to be the vibrant industry we've known, in my opinion. And I think maybe I do believe that research will find an answer for greening. The problem is the infrastructure's going away pretty fast. And they're talking about, for the DOC, there's certain ones saying, we need to start advertising, promoting again, and assessing dollars. Well, my problem, it's a different industry today than it was when generic advertising was really going.
Mm-hmm.
In the generic advertising days, the industry was a private label industry. 70% was private label, 30% was Minute Maid and branded products. So you could go generically to the chain stores and offer them promotions and work out and move volume. The brands today, it's in 3 brands, and that's it. And so they have proprietary ownership of their brand, and they're reluctant to get you impinging on whatever they're doing in the competitive world. So I'm saying it's a different world we're dealing with today. Plus, I don't believe they can generate, if you believe that what we were told in advertising all those years, the amount of volume, the gross rating points you need to get somewhere in the range 6,000, 6,500 for impact. They don't have, they never have the money to do that. And what good, I don't know if that is something that, I don't believe they can afford, growers can afford to do it today. I really don't. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my opinion at this stage. And the industry, I think this is going to be a shakeout year for the industry further, for growers. Because the 3-year contracts, this is the second year of the 3-year contract at $2.85 in the high numbers. Then next year, those will mostly go by the board. And unless the processors are they've been losing money to say the least on paying those prices. But the growers have to have that kind of return to sustain the production that they're doing and the cost.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I just don't know how that's going, it's gonna win out. I think you're gonna have large growers that are going to remain because they have the capitalization to do it. But smaller and smaller growers are probably going to run out of capital to continue to sustain what they're doing. I think that's gonna change.
Yeah, I talked to a lady who's been fighting hard to stay in the business, and she said, I just can't afford to throw $100,000 into my grove every year, you
Yeah.
know, and losing 100,000.
Right.
And that's going to come to the realization people are going to start to do
That's
that.
what
And it's
And the nostalgia part says, well, I want to, it's kind of like Gone with the Wind. We'll come back tomorrow, you know. Well, that's not, that's there in the back of the older, but the older of us, we're passing on, and we don't have. I had a passion for my work at Mutual. I mean, that was my life. I gave everything I had to working what I was doing at Mutual. And I didn't try to build myself, I always would build Mutual. Mutual is the one doing it, Mutual. That's what I tried to move every place that I did. And I would never tell people when I came back, when I was off on trading, working on this and see it. I mean, I had a lot of opportunities in that field when I was there. I mean, I've been to Buckingham Palace and had dinner with 60 people with the Queen and all that kind, but I never told people that because it wasn't me, it was where my position that I had put me in that position to be in those places. So I met a lot of people, and we did a lot of, it's all part of the work of what you're trying to accomplish and how you get there. And I worked all day and flew all night and ready to go the next day. That's how I did it. And I did it as efficiently as I could. I treated Mutual's money just like if it was better than if it was my own. And I just would not squander their money.
Well, the results speak for themselves. You know, where Mutual was when it started and where Mutual was. And there are a lot of things that were beyond our control. Well, we talked about freezes. We can't control that. So
right.
we did the best that we can. Well, I don't know about you, Bobby, but I'm glad that I'm not starting in the industry today. It would be, and I just admire the younger people who are hanging in there, and I hope that somehow we'll get to a point of sustainability.
Right.
That we can, we might not be there as far as the 1.5 million box packing houses.
Right.
We might end up going back to smaller packing
Right.
houses that provide a niche market, but it's going to be a challenge.
It is.
And us old guys can look back, and I'm like you. It was my life, and if you're kind of like me, you almost became immersed in the lives of these people you were involved with.
Right.
You know, it wasn't just as if you knew Art Mathias, but you knew Art's family, what was
Yeah.
going on there.
Right.
It was you were engaged in that
Right.
thing, and it wasn't just all about, you know, the number or something. It was about working with individuals and being able to share and participate in that. I still send out a newsletter. I got 200 growers that I communicate
Yeah,
with. And,
that's great.
We have a old timers luncheon, and 75, 80 of us get together and
I've been to
tell
a couple
stories.
of those.
Yeah, but it's
It's fun. I enjoyed it.
It's good. It's great.
The other thing that I think in coming on all this, they're doing these cups developments, covered, screen enclosure and growing it. And it told me the other day in a group, called me and talking to me, and they're spending $50,000 to $70,000 an acre to develop this. And Dundee has done 110, they're doing 220 acres. They have 110 in place and they're doing another 110. And I just don't, that's a tough nut. And they're gonna sell it fresh. Well, I said, well, buddy, You're gonna remind me when I was in Japan the first time in negotiations, they'd sell a grapefruit for $5 and $15 each.
That's kind of like tuna, huh?
Yeah, and I said, man, I was trying to sell a box of grapefruit for $2, and here they selling one piece for 15. And, but anyway, I'm just saying I hope the economics work, but that is tough.
Yeah, well,
The other thing I think is gonna happen, if they do find, the scientists, when they find an answer that is some way you can live with greening or you solve, you're gonna learn to live with it some way, probably. Then I think it's gonna be Wall Street money coming in and developing large tracts. It'll be in the hands of outside investors. It will not be the industry that we've known in the past, in my opinion. That's where the capital's going to come from. It'll be venture capital coming out of New York or someplace. That's what I think. I may be wrong.
won't be near as much fun as it was when
No,
we were there.
it won't. And then the other thing, I think, the industry, the thing that's changing is they're going to find some way with the harvesting labor needs. You're going to have to be mechanically harvesting more so than you've had as we move into this process of, if they continue this minimum wage and a guaranteed living wage and all this stuff, you have no choice but mechanical harvesting. And and I think there'll be some limited opportunity for fresh fruit. I think grapefruit is greening is probably closing that out.
It's pretty well working the grapefruit trees.
Yeah,
so.
it's pretty well done.
Yeah, well, you know, it's kind of a sad situation when you have to bring grapefruit in from Texas and navels in from California and run them through your packing house to supply your customers. And I just was shocked when I heard that. Of course, my contact with the industry is through the Hall of Fame
Yes.
and trade magazines
Yeah,
that I
right.
pick up online. I'm not out engaged all the time to
Right.
find some of those things out, but it's a different world.
Well, you go in the supermarket today, and I go in a lot. I'm buying more and more groceries here, helping you bet, but you know, I'm over the hill and I'm buying groceries. But anyway, look at the fruit from Florida that's packed. I mean, some from Van Conde. That's the worst looking fruit. I remember years ago, though, Don Lynn's had the ugliest fruit in the world, seal sweeter, and so they named it Homely's because it's so homely looking. Man, this is uglier than homely. It is awful.
Yeah.
And I don't know how it sells, to be honest with you. It's not. And I mean, the packing house, the pack house is just down, down, down. And
Well, they can't get quality. Greening impacts quality
That's
of
what it's
fruit.
right.
So, and yeah, it's changed. When I go now, I buy the little clementines.
Halos, yeah.
They call them different names, but
Different
they're
names.
clementines.
yeah, that's right.
And you and I are surprised that hell, we couldn't market a fruit that small. It wouldn't come anywhere close to meeting standards, but now we're doing it.
I used to had a grapefruit, a tangerine grove, Dancy. And I made great money selling Dancy tangerine, they clip them and everything. And man, the last 2 years, when Dancy's went, they sent me a bill at the packing house. And I said, that's the last time
That's right.
I harvested this grove.
That's right.
I said,
That's not what it's all about.
but, you know, when you get all said and done with every industry goes through a metamorphosis change. I don't care what industry you're in, and I think the industry is doing that not of its own will, but because of something introduced outside greening. And boy, and it's just such a tough virus and psyllid to find an answer for. I thought early on we could, as if we radiate the medfly, why can't you radiate the psyllid? Well, it's bisexual, you know, and here you go.
Yeah,
It's whatever he wants to be.
I was convinced that there was going to be some grad student in Iowa who was going to stumble across something, but
Yeah.
we haven't even found anything that comes close. Well, we're gonna quit before we get on the greening issue.
Yeah, I
That's,
understand.
that gives everybody the black ass so bad
It
that we
does.
gotta move on.
I
So
agree with that.
I'm gonna celebrate and thank you. You know, this is a classic example where you and I probably didn't spend much time talking like we did now to really
Right.
learn.
Right.
And I always knew you were a remarkable guy, but now I'm convinced that you're just unbelievable. The stories that we've shared, I really appreciate it.
Well, that's one of the things in close that I regret, that I just didn't have the time to really visit, and I didn't go hunting with groups. I just didn't have time.
Mhm.
I've worked, my whole deal was doing what I had to do.
You were from one crisis to the other.
I really was, and
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I did. And so I regret that, because I didn't have the interaction as much as I could have had in a social function with folks, but I didn't have the time, John, to do it. And so I only had so much capacity, and I had to do it for what they hired me to do, and that's what I did.
It's what you allocated it out to do. Well, I'm taking up for lost time myself. I'm going to have lunch with people.
It's me in different things to, when I left the Canners and went to Standard Sand and Silica as a general manager and operating chief and CEO, as a family, it didn't work for me. They were losing money, going broke, and I had to do so much so fast to turn the company around that it didn't sit well with the family. So I resigned after 6 months, because it just, they took the authority away and I had the responsibility and I couldn't do it. So the great people, I loved them, but it wasn't for me. I failed in that regard, but I learned so much through that 6 month, what I call failure, that about what to do in different situations. I'm a guy, if you got a problem, how do you solve it? And can you fix it? If you can't fix it, if it's impossible, you move on to something else.
Right, well, you grow through failures. I mean,
Yeah,
that's how
right,
you're gonna
exactly.
learn.
So, let me look here, man, if I can. Houses at Lake Alfred, Dr. Lee, they needed them for research, and they couldn't get the money, IFAS couldn't get it. So I went out and raised the money from different growers. We built them, got a bid, I built them, I literally built them for him and turned them over to them. But never said anything about that, but I mean, that gives you long-term good feelings that you've done something that is gonna reap a benefit down the road. And then at Mutual, I believe long-term, they needed a training, leadership program at IFAS, for young people.
Right.
And so for 4 or 5 years straight, they wanted you to commit $2,500. I don't like anything you pay forever. And I told Melton a different one, I said, I'll tell you what I'll do if I can. If we have the money at Mutual, I want to give we want to give $100,000 a year to go into a fund, to build a fund that you begin to invest in, and you need to have an endowment so you don't have to keep raising money, all of it. And so we gave about 4 or 5 years, we were able to give $100,000 a year to that, to get it going. Then Wedgeworth came in and gave some and named it after that was good. And I hope they've gotten more. I haven't followed it recently, but I hope they could. But
No, I think that's a very successful program.
It is.
You get all kind of people.
Oh,
Rex
God.
McPherson went through that
Yeah.
program, and had a call from him the other day. I went over to some meeting with some guy that he had met through the leadership thing. And so, you build networking with people that you haven't never have an opportunity to do so otherwise. So,
Yeah.
that's
You remember the Timmick that I was just thinking, Timmick? We had that in Victoria, the Orlando
Oh,
Sentinel
yeah.
was eating and we had a board meeting with Union Carbide, and they came in, and the researchers had been working on it and everything, and so the board said, well, what are we gonna do about Orlando Sentinel, the president? And I said, I think we ought to invite her to the meeting, not inside the meeting, but bring her, be ready. And so she was shot, and we went out and announced that we were recommending that they temporarily be withdrawn from use, they were shocked. They couldn't believe it. Well, the numbers, everything showed that that's what should be done. And one other thing I forgot to tell you is that when I was at the Canners, I hadn't been there too long, and Ralph Nader was doing he was investigating the citrus industry for pesticides. And so he was coming to Florida, a meeting at Lake Alfred, and wanted to talk to the Canners. And so Warren said, I want you to, 28 years old, I want you to meet with him. I'm not meeting with him, you meet with him, and out at Lake Alfred with him. And I said, well, and I'd have talked to his office and his people. I came out and said, Mr. Savant, there's no reason to think you need to divulge everything that's there, because they have it all anyway. They know more than we know. And I said, it's a fact that when we concentrate juice, if there's any residue there, you're concentrating at the higher level at 65 Brix. But when you dilute it back and finish the finished product, it's diluted to the point it's non-detectable, or certainly within all limits. I said, so my recommendation to you, to the board is, not to me, I'm not gonna say it to the board, up to, that we don't hold back, we be forthright and divulge everything, because they know it already. And that's what the board authorized to do. That was the best thing we did, because he was satisfied, we weren't trying to cover it up, never heard another thing out of it.
He attacked another windmill, didn't he?
Yeah.
Left this windmill alone.
So he left us and went on to somebody else. Anyway, those are things that you just don't really think about much.
Well, nobody knows those things too,
No,
those
they
kind of
don't.
things. So that's what's so wonderful about this, Bobby, is we come across things and little tidbits that, it's fascinating.
Yeah. One thing I didn't like about, you asked me what I didn't like in your paper that you read. I really didn't like dealing with personnel issues. I really don't like having to deal with those, because most of them, you really, when you get right down to it, it's kind of like 2 second graders talking. It's some little something, and I just don't like, I didn't like dealing with those type things, but you have to, but I can't say that's a favorite.
Yeah, that wasn't high on your list of things to do.
It really wasn't, but, and you always gonna have that in people.
Sure.
You think you got the greatest sales team going, and then, man, I got it made now, and then one of those disintegrates or something happens, and it's just part of the process. But I just didn't like dealing with.
Well, that was a necessary evil of the job. You
It was.
had to tolerate that.
Yes, you have to do that, and never like terminating people, because that's just a bad scene. The family, just a lot of people are impacted when people lose their job, and I don't like that. And I just never got involved at the DOC with their personnel. I had my own deal to do. I didn't have time to fool. And some of them said, "Why aren't you over here doing that?" I said, "Man, you run your place. I don't have time. I'm jam up where I am."
Yeah, I got all the heavy lifting I can do. You're going to have to find someone.
So I didn't I just never got into the nuances of what goes on within organization. I just didn't do that, and I just didn't. So I had all I could handle where I was, and some days I didn't think I could handle it myself. But I had good people working for me, working with me. I didn't say they worked for me. We worked together. They really worked, and I'll tell you one little story about the legislation. I had $1.5 million for appropriation for diaprepes in the appropriations bill, and it passed the House and Senate, went to conference, and the bill was supposed to be, it was in there, okay. Comes out, the president signs it, enrolled gross, and the president signs it, and it's left out. I said, oh my gosh, and IFAS was planning on this money, and we were too. So I went to see Jamie Whitten from Mississippi. He's about 90 years old, and good man, but he's been there forever. 52 years, I think he served. And I went and said, Mr. Chairman, I had my appointment, I went in to see him. He said, what can I do for you? I said, Mr. Chairman, I said, I have a problem. I said, I don't know. And I told him, I said, what happened? And I said, it passed the House and Senate, you put it in. Yes, I know. And I said, but it came out of the conference, I mean, the bill, and it was approved in conference, but it's in law, and it was excluded. What in the world can we do? Well, is that true? I said, well, yes, sir. He got the paper, bills out, the paper and all that crap. He said, he literally wrote it in a pencil, $1.5 million of diaprepes. And I said, now that's gonna be something. He says, okay, that's your money, it's done. I said, okay, yes, sir, well, thank you very much. Don't let it happen again. Now and it actually, the money was appropriated, not signed by the president. He just wrote it in on the bill.
Well, you should have said, my name is here, you can put that on the bus line. Well, isn't that amazing how in the system, how things like that can happen?
Really, it is. It truly is. And I don't know. I mean, I never let that happen again, the best of my knowledge. But I mean, I was flabbergasted, to be honest with you. And Avery Underhill, you know, worked for Mutual forever. He's the guy that he was the guy, the attorney. He was in the Justice Department when the cease and desist order was, and they engaged him, and he worked out no fine, no penalty, just cease and desist. And so then he was hired from that point forward. After he retired, he left the Justice Department. Then he was hired Mutual, and he continued to work for us until he died on my birthday 8 years ago. And super gentleman, but he knew he was a Democrat from the here to here, yellow dog Democrat, but he knew them all, boy. I mean, he could get along with Republican, Democrat, any of them, and he's just a super guy. And we got so poor we couldn't pay him much, and he said, you don't pay me anything, but we gave him a little bit. I gave him a little, paid him a little bit every month, not much, because I didn't have much. I didn't have anything to pay him with, and but he sent a birthday cake every month to every birthday to every member of the Congress from Florida, Texas, and we paid for it. Florida Central Mutual. It was the same type, same cake, an orange type cake, and
if it didn't come one year, they'd miss it, I bet.
yeah, and he's quite a guy. And but Andy Ireland was a great friend of ours when he was in the Congress, and his one of the worst feelings I ever had. We went up to see Lawton Child. We were in Washington, and we were seeing Lawton, Senator Childs, and we were in the meeting on EDB or whatever it was, and his staff started. Two of them, the staff members started walking toward me. The chief of staff, not chief of staff, because that was Charlie Kennedy, but the legislative director and an assistant. And by that time, Lawton said, "Bobby wants you to stay." Okay, so, well, good things are gonna happen or something. Boy, they all walked out of the room, and Chris and all walked out too, and I was left. And he got on to me and cursed me like I've never been cursed in my life. Beyond it, it really, and I don't get intimidated most of the time, but it just really hurt my feelings the way he was talking to me. And it was all about that we had not given him proper recognition versus Paula Hawkins. And I mean, I literally brought tears, I mean, tears to my eyes. I mean, it really just hurt that badly to think a friend of mine is talking to you this way. And I said, Mr. Chairman, I said, I thought we had, but I said, we'll certainly do a better job, and I'll get with Charlie Kennedy, and we'll plan, we'll work something out. And he kind of calmed down a little bit, and he ran it again. So I reassured him. I left, the staff came to me and said, Bobby, said, I'm sorry. So I wanted to get to you and warn you beforehand. I knew it was coming. It's been eating on him for months.
Wow.
He just doesn't like Paula Hawkins.
It's too bad. Too bad you couldn't have intercepted that a little earlier, but
Yeah. So, came back and got with Charlie Hawkins, you might remember. Anyway, we put together a big deal at the Marriott in Tampa. I got every ag organization in Florida, 38 or 40 of them. We plaqued him to death and recognized him and attaboy till you couldn't believe it. And he wanted, Charlie wanted a shotgun, an over and under shotgun. I said, okay. Found out how much it cost, and I told Charlie, he said, well, I don't know, I need to run it by him. He said, well, I said, he knows what it costs, he wants it. He says, he came back and said, I don't think it's gonna work. He said, he wasn't gonna, you can't give that much money. Somebody can't donate that, it exceeds his $25. I said, so I went back. I said, Charlie, I'm gonna go home. I'll go back to the office. I'll be back. I'll call you in a few minutes. I was walking back from his office in Lakeland back to Mutual. I said, I'll tell you what. I said, I'm gonna call him. I said, Charlie, I got it figured out. We're gonna have 450 people attending. That shotgun's $2,500. It's $4.08 or something. I figured out per person. We're within his guideline. He called and all. He said, that's fine. What a bunch of gymnastic stuff you have to run through, jump through to say.
Barbara Carlton should have given him the gun. She probably did anyway.
So we bought the gun and paid for it and moved on, you know.
Amazing, isn't it?
It is, it really is.
And sometimes huge issues, they just kind of wade through it, but little things like that could just eat and gnaw away like
Well,
that.
it's
And
kind
he
of
had
like
no
the story
idea.
at Citrus World one time. They had a meeting of the board, and they were spending $38 to $40 million on a new waste heat evaporator processing. They approved that in about 8 minutes. They would go buy 3 Ford 150 pickup trucks. They spent 2 hours discussing these Ford pickup trucks. So Joe Marshman finally asked us, Mr. Hunt said, what in the world? Said you proved $38 million in 8 minutes. We're 2 hours on these trucks. He said, we don't know a damn thing about the waste heat evaporator. We know a lot about trucks. So, you know, it's,
All right,
well,
we gotta do this again, man.
I enjoyed it.
We gotta do